All right, I am a fan of rewarding people who are on time, or at least not punishing them. Um, so I think we should jump in and get started. Thank you all for coming to this session on shaping the future of automated mobility. Um, we have a great group of speakers, and we're going to chat a little bit about this initiative that we've all been working on together for the course of the last couple of years around how automation is impacting cities, looking at automated vehicles, other automated form factors, thinking about how we prepare cities and communities for this new technology before they are all over our streets and sidewalks and airspace, so that we can think about the outcomes that we want to have, that we want to ensure for our communities. And so joining this conversation, did I skip over the who's here? I did. Um, Joining this conversation today, my name is Story Bellows. I am a partner with Cityfi. And we are also here with Nico Larco, who I'm sure you all know and needs no introduction at this point in the Urbanism Next Forum, but he is a professor and director of the Urbanism Next Center at the University of Oregon. Aaron Clark, who is a policy analyst in the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure for the city of Pittsburgh, and Sarah Abroff, who's on the Emerging Mobility team for the city of San Jose. So what is this initiative? This initiative was funded and started by the Knight Foundation a couple of years ago. They've funded Cityfi and Urbanism Next, along with 4 cities, to really look at the impacts um, of how cities can engage their residents around their mobility needs in an age of new technology, of automation, automated vehicles coming to cities. And we'll talk a little bit about how this initiative has changed over the course of the last couple of years, because given all of the changes that we've seen in business, I'm sure many of you know the Knight Foundation, and a lot of their work is really at the intersection of journalism, public information, community engagement. And so we've been really fortunate to be exploring how new technologies play into that. And so Cityfi is a consultancy that really equips public and private sector leaders to manage urban change. And we see a lot of that being driven by new technologies, but in the age that we're living in, the compounding crises, thinking about climate, thinking about equity, thinking about public health and justice, are all the types of issues that we tend to focus our work on. And I'll let Nico talk a little bit about Urbanism Next if he feels the need to do that, but I don't want to go over
I,
that too much, since you guys have probably all heard a lot.
I think everyone knows who we are. Not a problem.
Awesome. That's a good thing. So the cities that we are working with on this initiative are the cities of San Jose, Miami-Dade County, the city of Detroit, and the city of Pittsburgh. Um, and each of these has different use cases, different mobility needs, different partners, and different goals in terms of the outcomes that they're looking for their residents, the mobility challenges that they're each facing. And so the goals of this project really are to engage communities to understand their needs, engage the private sector to understand some of the competitive business cases that we're dealing with, and most importantly, I think, to work with cities to understand what levers they have to pull and how to leverage those assets that they have to generate equitable outcomes for their communities. And so as we look at where we are in thinking about automation and AVs, we see the potential to have really major impacts on cities, both positive and negative. And we could look at, reducing congestion and increasing safety, but there are also potential impacts on transit and on equity. And so these are some of the issues that we are eager to dive into with you all today, and that we've been focusing on. And so, as I think you all probably know, cities are really facing incredible pressures to adapt to change. We as cities can't really maintain the status quo if we want to proactively shape the streets and meet communities' mobility needs. And so, what we've all been really focusing on is thinking about what is the role of government in innovation related to AVs and automated mobility. We see so many new business models that now can't really scale without government partnerships. Um, and so, despite I think some of the hype that we're all seeing in terms of new mobility changes, um, some of the technology increases have actually slowed and will continue to be subjected to the rules that are put in place by cities and to market forces. And so we're thinking about how do we focus on community readiness and look at how we as cities can think about changing and shaping the regulations, the partnerships, the strategies that we have so that all of these new technologies can be deployed in ways that are beneficial for communities. They're beneficial for the bottom lines of these companies and their shareholders. And most importantly, they're beneficial and they're adding to positive outcomes in our cities around climate, around equity, around quality of life. There have been a lot of hiccups as we think about some of the rushing of technology to market in the automated vehicle space. And so this is one of the things that we're making sure that we are creating structures and pilot programs that allow us to create the conditions for successful outcomes and meaningful impacts of these technologies in cities. I'm going to keep jumping through as I look at the time. So, as we have thought about automation and automated mobility in the last 2 years, we've really shifted from just talking about robo taxis to seeing drones, to looking at self driving scooters, to looking at robots. Um, and we think about an age in COVID where it's not all about moving people. But as Nico was mentioning earlier, the conversations around delivery and freight that are going on, there's so much movement of goods. Um, and we've looked at this increasing speed of change, sort of the broad impacts of new mobility, um, thinking about what is the appropriate role of cities and government. Um, and it's changed our reality and our thoughts on the projections around AV deployment. I think 2.5 years ago, we were preparing for a future where robo taxis were going to be all over our city streets in like the immediate future, and we're not seeing that. And so we have all come to the table to start to think about how do cities, instead of working on the back end of companies that are looking to come in and test some of these robo taxis on their streets, how do we proactively shape some of the pilots so that we can better understand the impacts of some of these new form factors, more immediate technologies that may be able to operate as of right on our city streets right now? How do we ensure some of those outcomes that we're looking to have for our communities? So we focused on a new goods delivery pilot program where each of the 4 cities are going to be working together with a company called KiwiBot to test out very different use cases and very different street conditions, but to enable us to understand how communities are engaging with this new form factor, understand what are some of the operational issues and challenges that we're seeing, and what are some of the tools and levers that the cities can really put in place to ensure that this new technology is having a positive impact on the communities that they're looking to serve. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nico, who's going to talk a little bit more about this framework.
Thanks, Story. You can go to the next slide. So as Story mentioned, the goal of this project is really to figure out how it is that we can be making sure that these technologies arrive in a way that's equitable, right? That we're not having a ton of problems coming up with this. And what's become absolutely clear in this, and I mentioned a little bit in the opening yesterday, is that you have to take a long game approach to it. This is tremendously complicated, right? So initially, the hope was that we would figure out a community that could use this technology and would, a community of need that could use this technology that we'd implement there. And what you realize is there's a ton of different pieces that need to be figured out on the one hand to be able to do that well. And on the other hand, there's a lot of communities that maybe are, communities that are in need that shouldn't be tested on, right? A lot of these services are essential, and to test a technology that's not yet proven is actually putting those people at risk, and it's not a great approach. So what we really are finding is that what you have to have is a long game approach to this path to equitable deployment. So you got to figure out your incremental learnings across this entire piece, so you can end up shaping what you need to. That the ideal pilot, the ideal project, the ideal regulation is not likely and maybe impossible. So today we cannot say, oh, what we absolutely need to have is X. What we need to do is pilot these ideas, which has been a theme in a lot of the things that we've been hearing at the conference so far. So you can learn incrementally as you go, piece by piece, and figure out what the next one. So instead of this like, oh, this is what we need to do, let's run. It's more of a, all right, this is where we think we need to get to. Here are some steps to help us learn that. And then these are the series of pilots we might do to be able to get to that. So creating a roadmap to get you there. You can go to the next slide. Trying to get to this equitable deployment in this long game. Well, the two ingredients of this are really on the community engagement side, understanding what the equity concerns are, right? Identifying that whole list and figuring out how best to engage the community and what those concerns are. And then from the shaping deployment side, figuring out how it is that what the role of the city is, what the model of governance is, and then also what are your tools and levers? How do you leverage these things to get to the outcomes that you want? You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about two pieces of this, right? One of them is the kind of equity framework, how you figure out what the equity or the list of equity concerns that we can be addressing. And then the other side is the tools and levers. Those are the two main things I'm going to talk about today. So on the equity concerns, we organize this. This is almost like a checklist, right? And not a checklist of like, did I do this, but checklist of like, this is what I need to be paying attention to. And so I'm just going to go through some of these quickly. So Story, if you can go to the next one. So there's these individual level factors and societal level factors. So if you have an equity pilot that you're trying out around AVs or around new mobility, I'd say like, these are all the questions you need to ask yourself. So geographically, does the travel option fit with user needs, right? Is it serving something you need? And is the service available in the areas that you need it to be available? On the next one. From the financial side, is it affordable? Is the service affordable? Are there ways of payment, specifically for the unbanked? Do people have smartphone access? Next slide. If people have smartphone access, are they familiar with how to use it? Right? Because a lot of times people have the smartphone, but they don't understand all the different ways that you can use it outside of email and text, for instance. Is it in the language they can be that they're familiar with? Do they have a sense of ownership of this service so they can actually help shape it? And is the service consistently going to be there? Can you start trusting? Can you start changing the way that you're moving based on on that service? Next slide. In terms of accessibility, are the vehicles themselves accessible? Can you get into and out of them? And then can you take things like aids that you're going to need to travel, especially thinking about issues with older adults? Next slide. Safety and security. Are you physically safe in this? From crashes and such. Are you personally safe in this, especially as we think about shared mobility? And is your privacy, your data safe in this? All issues that need to be talked about. Next slide. And then in terms of more of a societal level, so if that was the individual trip, on societal level, it's a bunch of factors. Is this mobility options improving issues for the underserved? And one of the key parts of that is, are these mobility options, especially as we think about autonomous vehicles and how they've been used or as their models of transportation network companies, TNCs, are they going to impact transit? So if we end up building up AVs, and there's a ton of them running around, but it hurts transit, is that could have a severely inequitable outcome. Next slide. Environmentally, is this helping? Basic questions, impact on carbon emissions. I also put land use, land consumption as part of that. And then finally, on the economic side, is this helping in your local community, help create jobs, and are the profits being brought back into your community, right? So you can almost think of this as if you're working on a pilot, these are the issues you need to be dealing with on the equity side. Next slide. So now if we look at the tools and levers side, right? So models of governance actually ask the questions and of what is it that what's the role of cities, right? Are they just allowing things to happen? Are they actually active partners in this? Are they potentially even franchisees in this? That's the kind of a part that we talk about in that section of the report. And I'll put the report link in the chat in just a moment. And then we have the tools and levers side. And this, the main idea, you can go to the next slide. The main idea behind this is, let's focus on all the things that cities can be doing that are not only regulation and fees, for instance, but these are all the things the ways that cities can bring benefit to companies, and so some carrots, but also some sticks of things that they can be doing to help regulate this space. So these are, we're really excited to put this together. This is a combination of issues that, or ideas and actual tools that cities are using around the country, around the world, to help shape how deployment happens. So in terms of education and coordination, you can go to the next slide. Next slide. That's the right slide. Apologies. So in terms of education, public education outreach, there's huge opportunities for the cities to be helping educate communities, creating forums for these things, help understand community needs, but then also helping the mobility companies understand those community needs. In terms of stakeholder coordination, the city has opportunities to help develop trust between stakeholders, between the city and the private sector companies, but also between private sector companies. They can create forums for conversations, and I point to Antwerp, the city of Antwerp, that's done this tremendously well to actually create a space where you can start dealing with a lot of these issues and figuring out what could be and needs to be done. And then finally, cross-agency coordination. That is a tremendous benefit to private sector companies and something that cities can be doing and offering as a benefit. And again, this is, you can leverage those things. You can create a better kind of environment ecosystem and then leverage these things. Next slide. So in terms of allowing, shaping, assistant, and providing AV services, this is the actually like kind of where the rubber hits the road. So there's all sorts of things you can do here in terms of cities. So first of all is simply the enabling legislation. Are you allowing these services, right, AVs, or put new mobility here, on to function in your city? Like, is it allowed, right? And that's the base, most simple way of doing that. And that's actually a lot of what's being preempted right now at state levels. In terms of shaping the market, there's all sorts of things that cities can do. And we're seeing this happening. Scooters are a really good example. You're limiting the number of operators, you're limiting the number of vehicles, you're ensuring compliance, right? To make sure that the market is being created in a way that is still competitive, so it's not a monopoly, but also is not so competitive that you're going to end up having market failures and people that not really wanting to be engaging in that. In terms of operational limits, requirements, and tools, this is really the sticks, right? So do you need permits to operate here? Do you have limitations such as vehicle miles traveled or cruising limits? Are there fees that you're imposing across this? Are there certain requirements you have for service area coverage or vehicle accessibility or options for the unbanked or language requirements, right? These are all pieces that can be done. And to me, this is probably the space that has had, as we look across the new mobility world, this is where most of the work has happened. And again, this is very much on the stick side of the carrots and stick equation. So maybe not the friendliest way to be building trust between different stakeholders. So one of the things that's in the toolkit, but not the only one. And the next one is process assistance. So that's really talking about how do we do things from the city side of facilitating procurement, absolutely helpful for companies, dedicating staff time and staff resources to help these things kind of exist, and especially for pilots as things are first starting up, figuring out how you can most easily allow variances. Now, this is the idea here is not that we are opening the floodgates or just clearing the path. The idea is that you're doing some path clearing in exchange for those things that we talked about before that we needed on the equity side, right? So you're figuring out what benefits you're creating so you can help leverage these things. And then finally from this group, the purchasing and subsidizing AV services. So this is the not happening tremendously yet right now, obviously, but this is the idea that government might actually pay for some of these services. You're definitely starting to see governments talk about that with bike share and scooter share, which is if this is beneficial to city goals, right, the outcomes that you want, you might actually give money to these projects or actually purchase the service yourselves, almost like be a franchisee for these things. Next slide. So next slide, Story. Oh, sorry, before that. There you go. So in terms of infrastructure investment, things that cities can do. So on the technology and data side, one is just setting up the data standards. So that MDS exists, right? That you're setting the opportunity for interoperability between different services. That is a tremendous help to companies. The other part is data sharing and reporting requirements. This is oftentimes seen more as a stick than a carrot, but just saying like these are the types of things that you need to be providing from the data you need providing, and then also encouraging or actually developing mobility as a service or the platforms. And this is LA is a really good example. It's really trying to help make these things happen. Those again are all helps. And the physical infrastructure investments and management, a whole lot of things you can be doing here. Travel lane access, figuring out who's allowed where, curbside management, enormous opportunities with that, making your infrastructure tech ready, which can mean either that you actually have technology, or for instance, in the pilots that we're doing right now with these cities, making sure you have sidewalks that are, don't have enormous cracks in them, or that are wide enough for these vehicles to go through. And then congestion management, especially as we think about the future with autonomous vehicles, and even now with TNCs, congestion management is a benefit to everyone in this. So again, these are all tools and levers that cities can be using to help get to shaping those earlier equity needs that we were talking about. Next slide. So just to reiterate, the whole idea here is making sure that you are figuring out what your city needs in terms of equity, right? And that framework is a really important piece of it. And then figuring out how it is that you shape that. Next slide. And so we can use this kind of framework. I'm going to put the link to the report that talks about all this in the chat in just a moment once I'm just done talking here. But you can use that to figure out what you need to do. Experiences that you understand, like things that some of these tools and levers that you've done, equity concerns that you understand well or don't. So important thing. But then, the really big suggestion is create a roadmap. Figure out how you create a pilot that gets you to the next bit of information. How are you going to then implement that, evaluate, and then pivot, right? Figure out how you get to the next piece. So much more iterative pilot, and from Warren Logan's conversation this morning, start really small, try to get the thing out, learn from that piece, and then you can start expanding it and amplifying it. And with that, I will pass it off to, I think, Aaron, right? Or no, Sarah.
Sarah. Thanks so much, Nico.
Thanks, Nico. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Aroff, and I am here to talk about what we're doing at the City of San Jose. So next slide, please. So to talk a little bit about the long game, as Nico mentioned, we really like to use pilots to think about what our long game goals are. We have a policy framework in place that allows us to do demonstration pilot partnerships to test, evaluate, and demonstrate new technologies. One of the reasons that we want to do this is we want to prepare for the future as much as we can. Of course, nobody can predict what happens, but when we know about a new technology coming out, it's better for us as a city to possibly partner with that technology if it makes sense, to be able to test it a little bit and to know what's happening. And in that way, we can actually see what works, what doesn't, in maybe a more, I don't want to say controlled setting, but maybe in a certain geography, maybe in a certain area. So those are some of the reasons that we want to do these pilots. And lastly, a really big piece for us is that we want to be able to engage the community around these pilots before they get deployed, these technologies get deployed on a larger scale. So it's really helpful for us to be able to get feedback from different residents in different areas, for them to be able to see what's actually being rolled out, to respond to it, and to let us know how they're feeling. And that can inform what we do later on. Next slide, please. So the first example I'm going to talk about is AV passenger pilot that we did. It has now been suspended just since COVID started. but we were doing pilots with our Mercedes, Bosch, Daimler, and this was for self-driving cars. And one of the primary goals was to see how the community felt about it in general and what safety concerns they had. And, one of the things we really wanted to do was, we had these great goals of engaging the community, seeing how they felt, having them really give as much feedback as possible. And it was funny because the feedback we actually got was that they had a lack of awareness of AVs. I mean, not everybody, but generally that was a part of it. And also we were hearing that there was a little bit of a mismatch between their current needs and the AV mobility. So it wasn't that they didn't want AVs, but their concerns were more, I want to get from point A to point B. I don't know if it matters that much if it's in an AV or not. So those were some of the findings we had for that project. And like I said, when COVID happened, a lot of the passenger testing got stopped, and we actually have moved into goods delivery. So a story, next slide, please, and I can start talking about that. So what we're working on now is a delivery robot pilot, and we're working with KiwiBot, as Nico had said. And we have an MOU with KiwiBot. So in our agreement, they are going to be operating in our city for a certain amount of time. Part of the agreement for us was that there would be a significant amount of data sharing and that they would be using MDS to give us that data. So, what I was just mentioning is that this actually began during COVID. So there was a lot of emphasis on this touchless delivery and what that could be like. It's interesting because as we've been doing that, we're maybe seeing the light at the end of the tunnel with COVID, and a little bit of our goals are shifting. But still, we are really interested in trying this out in specific urban areas. They've been operating downtown, and we're trying to expand that maybe to some other areas that wouldn't normally see KiwiBots. We want to evaluate specific equity-based use cases and get them involved in doing delivery that's beyond just what we think of like typical restaurant delivery. Are there use cases we can find that would really benefit different communities in our city? Next slide, please. And I'm just going to talk a little bit here about using partnerships to achieve our goals, because we think it's really important to be partnering and working with the private sector and to have shared goals, to have a lot of communication, to kind of set our goals up front. I have some examples here about what we did with Mercedes and then also with KiwiBot. So for example, with Mercedes, we co-presented with them at community meetings. And we also engaged, the police, for instance, to talk about different testing scenarios, obviously city agency. And then we also held community workshops, and we had testing and feedback sessions with different communities. And that was all something we did in partnership with them. With the KiwiBot pilot, we are having close coordination with a lot with the data sharing. We also want them to address our goals as a DOT overall. So things like Vision Zero, curb management, how can we work with them on these things? And we're also having close discussions with them about community needs. How can we use KiwiBot to go into communities they wouldn't normally go into for their business cases? And we're finding the partnership like this to be really great during a pilot as something we can learn from before we go longer term with any of these technologies. So that's it for San Jose.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sarah. And with that, I'll turn it over to Erin Clark from Pittsburgh.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. I want to talk today. I think Nico and Sarah and Story have done a really good job kind of talking about that big picture, and then Sarah talking more specifically about San Jose's experience. And I want to maybe even get like more specific about an example in Pittsburgh that we've kind of recently gone through that just really highlights the importance of pilots and what we've learned in Pittsburgh. And I also just want to highlight that while cities are working toward this long game, it's become more and more apparent as we've worked as a cohort under this Nice Night initiative, how important it is to work with other cities and share the lessons that we're learning. We learn so much from each other and are stronger in our response and how we kind of handle emerging technology because we've worked so closely together. And I think we've become aware in Pittsburgh that these companies, although they are competitors, they also have very similar goals and they're working together. They're talking often. Cities need to be doing the same to kind of set our expectations and kind of a game plan moving forward. But in any event, we can go to the next slide. So this is just quickly an overview, a bit of background, and provide a timeline with personal delivery devices and our experience here in Pittsburgh. I'm going to walk through some specifics here, but just broadly, Starship Technologies approached the city about a pilot deployment on the University of Pittsburgh's campus in summer of 2019. Our director here in Pittsburgh of the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure had kind of the foresight to know that although we were going to welcome this pilot, that we needed to be sure that Starship was communicating and meeting with community members in Oakland, which is where the University of Pittsburgh is here, and addressing community questions and concerns before the launch. And so Starship did that. And I think it just opened those initial lines of communication and proved to be really important. September to December of 2019 is when Starship deployed their pilot. And at the end, they reported data to DOMI, the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, and some narrative on the evaluation of the pilot. We then, taking that feedback, extended Starship's permit for an additional 3-month pilot. But at the start of the pandemic, Starship ceased operations in Pittsburgh. And so we hadn't had much activity, but we had those 6 months almost of experience with the personal delivery devices in Oakland. And then, as I'll discuss on the next slide, we had some important state legislation passed through last year that we luckily were prepared to respond to in light of our experiences with our pilot. So you can go to the next slide. So just kind of briefly about that initial pilot that started in September of 2019. There weren't too many terms and conditions around the pilot. And to be honest, the use case of this pilot didn't necessarily serve many of the city's mobility goals. The primary benefit we saw with this pilot was to learn about the technology and also hopefully to start to reduce some of those single occupancy deliveries in passenger vehicles that we see from, Grubhub and Uber Eats and others. But the terms and conditions of the pilot were just that commitment from Starship to engage with residents and community groups. There was a set geography, a geofenced area around Pitt's campus where the devices could operate, and we limited the maximum number of devices that could deploy at any given time. And some of the lessons we learned through that pilot were, because these devices can't communicate their intentions with humans easily, conflicts or perceived obstructions can occur. And so specifically, we had a resident who uses a wheelchair crossing at a crosswalk, and there was a PDD waiting near the curb ramp on the other side. The device was obstructing a bit of the curb ramp, and probably in retrospect, the individual could have navigated around the device, but she didn't know what the device was going to do when she started approaching it and felt obstructed from getting onto that curb ramp, which is a huge safety problem. And, something we didn't necessarily fully anticipate happening. And so when that happened, Starship completely ceased their operations. They met with the resident, met with the university, met with the city, and altered their technology so that the devices stopped further back from the curb ramp, so that that conflict and obstruction, whether perceived or real, would not occur. And so that was just a way we were able to quickly iterate, and kind of a lesson that we learned during that pilot. In addition, the experience and interaction with new technology during these kind of slightly more controlled pilots, or where the city has a lot more engagement with the pilot, allows us and the public to learn what we don't know. There's, I'll talk actually in the next slide, I think, but learning what we don't know is very important to these pilots. Knowing the right questions to ask ends up being so important as these devices begin to deploy more widely and to scale. But you can go ahead to the next slide. So in October of 2020, the PA legislature passed a bill that authorized personal delivery devices in Pennsylvania and provided sole authority to our state DOT to authorize and regulate the operations of PDDs. This new law, which went into effect at the end of January of this year, includes PDDs under the definition of pedestrians, defines them as devices that are less than 550 pounds without cargo, so empty. It allows the PDDs to operate at speeds up to 12 miles per hour in pedestrian areas, and it preempts local governments from regulating the operation of the PDDs. And so if you want to go ahead on to the next slide, as maybe is becoming clear now, our experience with the devices, though we have so many concerns with this new law, allowed us to be informed advocates when our state DOT was considering what that authorization process would look like and drafting their operating policies. Pittsburgh was the only city in the state that had any experience at all with PDDs, even though our pilot was fairly limited and only a 6-month duration. The experience allowed us to provide informed recommendations to PennDOT to lean on our stakeholders who already had experience in the communities with the devices. And we, I think PennDOT relied on us more than other cities to provide those recommendations. And we had kind of more authority in the feedback that we gave. So local pilots, we obviously didn't foresee that when we first started this pilot, but pilots can have so many benefits at the local level and really generate usable information about how this technology operates in the real world. Other benefits of local pilots and oversight is just that cities understand the local needs better. We're on the ground with residents, we're engaging with them, talking with them. We have working groups in Pittsburgh to discuss automated mobility. We meet with them every other month, so there's very consistent open dialogue, and that really helps us better understand local needs. We're, hand in hand with that, we're closely connected with our constituents. It's easier to meet with them locally. Cities can quickly iterate. So the example with the curb ramp and the PDDs in Pittsburgh, we were able to quickly halt all operations with Starship, address the situation, and relaunch and avoid that moving forward. And public participation is just easier at the local level. We have our stakeholder groups who are very invested and informed with these personal delivery devices here now, and can really effectively engage with us. They provided us with so many recommendations and insights that we were then able to pass on to PennDOT during this experience. You can go to the next slide.
Seeing that? I think I switched to the last one.
Yeah, it came up. Sorry about that. I think I had a lag on my side. So the long game, I think we've obviously kind of talked a lot about this long game, and Nico gave a ton of great information. I want to talk a little bit about kind of what we've learned in light of this pilot and this experience with the state law and the preemption that we've now learned should be kind of 4 broad categories that we start to consider at the start of a new pilot. And so just thinking about submission information, what's the authorization or permitting process going to be? What is that information that you should be collecting from the the operator, regardless of what the kind of new mobility is, but what should we be collecting from them on the front end before they even deploy, and as we consider whether or not they should deploy in our communities. Operations, the appropriate time, place, and manner that these devices should operate. Unfortunately, we're really limited now at this because of the preemption language in the state law, but we've had a lot of conversations in Pittsburgh about when and where these devices should operate, because they operate in pedestrian areas. So maybe on off-peak times is more appropriate to make deliveries than during times where there's more congestion on our sidewalks and pedestrian areas. And then parking and idling, all of these kind of operational considerations. And then also what's become really apparent during this process is customer service and emergency response. Engaging our first responders has been really critical in the city as well. They would have no idea how to stop a PDD on the sidewalk who's speeding, or how to enforce laws against these personal delivery devices. And we didn't have the answer to that to give them either, but we've begun those discussions with our state DOT and with the private sector to say, okay, what is the emergency response plan? We need to provide that to our first responders before you begin operating. And then data performance reporting, Nico and Sarah both touched on. So I think I'll not go into too many details there, but just through these pilots and engagement, we've learned a lot about the operational constraints of PDDs as well, the barriers that prevent PDDs from being useful to certain populations. So again, Nico touched on this, but we are exploring where these PDDs could be beneficial. And we're learning that, digital literacy, access to smart devices, payment methods, and accessibility of these devices can't unload themselves. They require someone to bend down and pull them out, which isn't easy for all of our residents. And so just learning kind of about those operational constraints and taking those questions and concerns back to the manufacturers and the service providers to say, how can we solve this solution? Like, we think these could be beneficial, but only if they can do this. And so we've just learned a lot through engaging closely and consistently with our community. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Erin. And with that, I am going to stop my screen share. And I will jump in with questions, but if others want to put some of your questions either in the chat or raise your hand, I will certainly be happy to call on folks. So one of the things that, we could say that this project has, totally changed because of COVID, but that would be probably a bit of an untruth, because I think we were all sort of wrestling with the structure of these pilots prior to that. And, as we think about being big advocates for pilots and using pilots to generate learnings, they're not all created equal. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you are thinking about the learnings you hope to get from pilots that the cities are now driving in terms of the personal delivery devices with KiwiBot versus some of the other projects that were in pilots that were coming into your city. Are you thinking about learnings differently?
I can go first. So just to clarify, you mean like when we're working directly with KiwiBot to launch a pilot, as opposed to if a provider comes in and kind of launches without the city's participation? Yeah,
or maybe even with the city's participation, but it's different when you're kind of in the driver's seat with that.
Yeah, we are still looking forward to launching. Well, I'll at least speak on behalf of Pittsburgh, but I think all the cities are really looking forward to launching this pilot with KiwiBot, because we have this funding available through the Night Initiative, which allows us to take control of what this deployment looks like and really collaborate closely with KiwiBot. And so we kind of are setting our data reporting requirements, we're also kind of giving the final sign off on that, the service area and the use case, and allowing our community's voices to play a role in what that service area and use case looks like. And I think that's, a rare opportunity for cities to have. And I think starting with this pilot, we're really focused on engaging and educating the communities about these devices, allowing them to experience the technology, and also just learning the basics about what the presence of a sidewalk robot has on our other human road users. And iterating, adjusting, being prepared when these devices maybe deploy more widely, or in Pittsburgh's case, because we have limited regulatory authority now, we really feel the urgency to plan and prepare when other companies who come in who maybe aren't so willing to work closely with the city, learning the lessons that we can now about what the presence of PDDs will do to the public space and to our human residents. But I'll let Sarah answer.
Yeah, I was going to say that in contrasting the two pilots that I presented on, I think what's really exciting about KiwiBot right now and taking some learning from the Mercedes is that when we did the community work with Mercedes, like a lot of people weren't aware of AV or didn't see it for them. And because there's so much safety issues around these passenger vehicles, we really couldn't get people in and just do test drives. We're not at that point. So with bringing KiwiBot in, what's interesting is that the way we're doing the community engagement is going to be kind of on the ground. They're going to see it. They're going to be using it. They're going to really be able to engage with it, because right now, when we've talked to some community members, like they don't even know what it is. They can't really fathom it without seeing at least a picture of it. And I think probably won't understand it until it's really on the ground for them. So I think that is a big difference with KiwiBot. And it's also something we've learned. We've learned that we have to, especially with new technology, people don't know what it is until they're seeing it, which is one of the really big values of just getting the pilot out there and seeing how people respond. Because if we prep and prep and prep and nobody sees it, our prep work could be all for nothing.
If I can jump in and kind of the comments you're all making are kind of answering one of the questions that just came in about how do you most effectively reach out to residents in communities that are going to be hosting these deployment and involve them in decisions and such. Some of the things that we saw, and Sarah, you can talk a little more about this, but especially in San Jose, you have to meet people where they're at. So, calling a meeting or, sending out a survey is nowhere near as effective. They had this whole program where they actually went into parks and set up booths and had like people come in. And, the story that I've told a million times since hearing it from that experience, where when they talked to the community and they said AV, a lot of people thought they meant audiovisual equipment, right? Mm-hmm. So like there's a total kind of disconnect at times. And then the other thing,
video.
Or adult video, sorry.
The other one we got in San Jose.
And the other thing that I think was really a huge learning as we went through this, some of the things that happened last year was that you have to, there's different types of pilots and they all have different learnings. And this is what we were talking a little bit when we were saying the long game, you got to figure out what pilot you want to do. Like some pilots are just touch and feel. Like it is just a vehicle out there that you can walk around or open up or sit inside, or maybe it takes you, like half a block. Those are fantastic to get communities to understand what it is the issue is, and to build trust, actually, to start to build trust both in the technology, if trust is warranted, but also to build trust in the city as like a communication partner and all these. And then there's there's pilots that start to be higher order and that they're actually starting to provide services. But again, those things might not be getting to your end community goal, but are helping you understand the opportunities. And then there's pilots that actually like serve the community needs. I'll give one example really quick from Pittsburgh that Karina Ricks from Pittsburgh talks about all the time, is that, their first pilots, is that Aaron described there with Starship, Karina says all the time, this was getting burritos to college students, right? It was not anywhere in the city's plans to do a better job of getting burritos to college students. But yet that pilot was really important for them to build the trust with the community, understand the issues, and then have these conversations when the preemption actually came out.
Yeah.
I want to, I
Go
was
ahead,
going to
Story.
add to make sure that we jump into and answer this question that did come in around, what you found for most effectively reaching out to residents, and involving them in decision making around the routes and service hours. And if you guys have specific learnings from that from San Jose and Pittsburgh.
Sure. Regarding the Mercedes-Benz pilot, Nico touched on it a bit. So with that, we actually went to the community that we were going to be testing in, and we set up in a park there. We went to where they were. We held workshops, at all hours when people could be coming and going. We didn't get to the point of determining routes and that kind of thing with residents. Those kinds of workshops were more to be gaining understanding of what people's perceptions were. As far as with KiwiBot, what we're doing is we're actually trying to partner with local community groups in the areas we're interested in going into, and seeing if the community groups, how they feel about it, because they know their residents the best. And so far the discussions we've had have been really positive. They love that we want to get their residents' opinions and their feedback. So we're partnering with these community groups, and the community groups are then reaching out to residents and smaller groups to see if they're on board to do this kind of thing. And I have to say, we're also not going to just deploy a whole bunch of robots in an area. How we're starting is we're probably going to identify a handful of individuals who are willing to receive some kind of delivery this way. So it's kind of all controlled. They know what they're getting. We know that for this, they'll be able to get the delivery from the robot, and we're going to start small and then scale up from there if we think it's appropriate.
Yeah, and I think we're kind of taking a similar approach in Pittsburgh. We also have started first with connecting with our community organizations, and they not only know their community members well, but they also know how to reach them effectively. So, for instance, in one of the neighborhoods we're considering for this pilot, we have had initial conversations with some of the board members of the community organization, and they are generally interested, although have obviously a lot of questions and concerns that they want addressed. But they said, we're talking about next steps and engaging more widely with the community members. And they said, well, we'll need at least 2 weeks because many of our community members are a little bit older and don't use social media or email as much. And we actually do physical flyers on their door to make them aware of community meetings right now and of what we're going to discuss. And so, that's not necessarily an approach the city would have taken right off the bat, to go and hang flyers on every door in this community. And by partnering with that community organization, they've really helped us to start reaching the community members more. And we also are going to empower those community members to help us make decisions about routes and service areas once we start those more broad conversations. We're approaching this that we don't necessarily want to empower the community to fully scrap this pilot, because we think there's important learnings to be gained, but we do want their feedback on routes, service areas, how many robots should deploy. One example is that we've already gotten the feedback that the first week, or while the company's mapping, the community really wants city staff and KiwiBot staff to walk with the robots so that community members who pass can answer questions about them before they even deploy and start providing the service, which I think is a really great idea and a way to kind of do that, to provide that interaction before the service actually launches and let the community members see the devices. But yeah, I think starting with those organizations that are formed, and it doesn't have to be formal community organizations. We also go to church leaders sometimes in communities that don't have more formal community organizations. Wherever, to Nico's point, go to where the people are, where they're gathering, and where they have a trusted leader in their community, go there first and start the conversations.
In our last minute, I would love to get a lightning round from all of you. We've talked a lot about the learnings on the engaging community side, but we've all had a number of conversations around engaging the private sector and what we've learned in terms of what makes a good partner. And I'm wondering if you have one or two quick things that you could mention that you've learned that would be useful for folks from the private sector in terms of how to be a better partner to cities.
I can go first on that one. I think just like transparency, I feel like there always feels like this wall up between government and the private sector where we feel like we're not experts on the technology and they're not telling us everything we should know because they want their like technology or service to be successful. And maybe we withhold or aren't as clear as we should be about the city's goals and our concerns or hesitations about the technology. And so in Pittsburgh, what we're attempting to do is I meet monthly with our AV tests, our passenger service AV testers one-on-one. Sometimes those agendas are like very light. We don't have anything super important to hit on, but that like very consistent communication with the private sector to humanize them and to just open that line of communication has started to in the right direction toward developing that trust and allowing there to be more transparency.
To say transparency, I was going to say the same thing. It's the most key piece of this. And I think just being upfront about what our concerns are and then also what our goals are and what the benefits to the city can be for us to share that with the private company. And if we can hear that also from the private company, it just allows a more transparent flow of information and kind of sets the tone for what we're doing next.
Nico, anything else? Any final words to add on that one?
I was just going to say, God, it has become like every time that we have meetings with the team, like the larger group, trust is always like an ongoing theme, figuring out how you do that, how you build trust. And I think that like trying to figure out what people need so you can figure out how you can help each other out as well is a great way, right? So like, what is it, the private sector, what is it that you could really be helpful? I remember with KiwiBot, one of the things they said was they would really love to have some space to be able to put their bots in. And I don't think any of the cities had thought of like, oh yeah, that's something we could offer. But I think all of them are like, oh yeah, that's really easy. And for them, this was a huge win. Like for KiwiBot, like you have to have those communications so that you can figure out how to help each other out. So then you can figure out how you can also ask for things.
Absolutely. Relationships matter. Trust matters. And we will continue to share what we are learning from the relationships across these cities and with the private sector. And please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if you have any additional questions or ideas for the work that we're doing. Want to thank Nico, Sarah, and Aaron for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your sessions.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.